the Internet Democracy Project works from a feminist perspective. That doesn't mean we always start from a gender perspective specifically, but obviously gender, sexuality have been issues that have been informing our work from the very beginning. And actually the first study we did on online abuse, for example, dates back from 2012. So since that time, we have really tried to map and follow these issues quite consistently. For today's meeting, I wanted to start by setting the context a little bit. And specifically, I went to look at the most recent figures collected by GSMA. This was before the pandemic, but published in 2020. And what they showed was that when it comes to mobile phone ownership, in India, 79% of men and 63% of women are supposed to have a mobile phone. That means there is a gender gap of about 20% in ownership. Women are much less likely, though, to have a smartphone than men do. There, the gender gap is actually about 60%. And as we know, smartphones are really crucial enablers for mobile internet access and use. When it comes to internet, we see that gap reflected in a way. Men, about 42% of Indian men access the internet, but only 21% of women, which means there is a gender gap of 50% there. It's still a reduction though. The gap is a reduction compared to earlier years, and seeing that smartphone usage among Indian women is still so low, the assumption there is that actually the gap is being closed for women more through the use of smart feature phones than actual smartphones. What's positive news, though, is that the awareness of the mobile internet among women is growing. According to GSMA, only 19% of women were aware of the internet in 2017, but that has risen to 50% in 2019, and I think that's a real potential. Access, though, is not an on-off switch. It's a continuum where even after women actually get access to a phone and are allowed to use it, there are so many restrictions. And Urvashi already touched on these issues and how they play out. This is not, of course, linked to mobile phones, right? We see that access to resources is an issue again and again for women. There has, for example, in India been a very rich debate in the feminist movement around access to land and how crucial it is to have more equal gender relationship, to have women own land or co-own land as well. And a lot of initiatives have been taken around that. In that sense, mobile phones are really another resource that we really need to think about in that broader social context in the same way as we did with land. What is specific about mobile phones, though, is that they are a particular threat precisely because of the autonomy that they provide, right? So as Urvashi was also already pointing out at, it actually is a window into the world for girls, where they could potentially explore on their own terms. And so how we need to see mobile phone bans by Ka Panchayat, restrictions by families, etc., is precisely that they are aware of this. In that sense, the current situation is both an opportunity and a crisis. And I think it's really important not to forget the opportunity part, right? We're having this problem precisely because mobile phones can really create a new space, and we need to retain that space. So what it means in terms of when once girls have access to mobile phones, in our research, for example, on the Panchayat bans in Western UP and Haryana, we found that the bans as such were not necessarily in the communities we looked at effective in terms of stopping access for girls completely. But it was in terms of restricting access of girls in time. So they were not allowed to use mobile phones on the street. They were not allowed to take them out of the house in many cases. Mobile phone use was something you would do at home on Sunday morning when somebody could look over your shoulder. And so that's the second point. It's not just restriction in time, it was also supervised closely. And what girls actually get to do when they are on a mobile phone is watched in ways that doesn't happen for boys. In our research, we also found that girls themselves were very conscious of this. And they would constantly use the phrase, you have to be responsible in using the internet, which interestingly, boys didn't in the same way in our conversations with us. So they were contrasting a lot of irresponsible use with the responsible use that they themselves were actually doing. It was interesting. I'm quite sure that girls would do things that are not necessary, or try to do things that their families do not necessarily approve of as well. But what's interesting about this finding is that the norm had such a strong impact on the girls that they felt they had to represent their users in that language of being responsible. The impact you can see quite clearly, for example, when it comes to social media usage in India. Only about a quarter of all Facebook users in India are supposed to be women. In many countries, actually, there are more women than female than male Facebook users. In India, in 2018, so it's slightly dated figure, but Learn Asia found that the social media gender gap in India is 60%, which was even bigger than the internet gap they found at that time. In general, also, GSMA found in its work from this year that women actually use fewer things, or they use their phone for fewer different use cases than men would do. For women, it was 4 per week, for men 7. So men would use 7 different apps for 7 different types of actions. And again, what it shows is that the kind of usage that happens is really controlled and more narrow for women than for men. It's important really to ask what are the consequences of this, right? It's not just about what happens right now. What we see is that girls clearly have far fewer opportunities to play with tech in general than boys do. Even if they do have access, they do not have a chance to roam around on the internet in the same way that many boys do. And in the long term, that also means that their familiarity with the technology and what they will be able to get out of it just will not be the same. I think we really need to start thinking also about the long-term domino effect of this, right? Even say, so what does it mean in terms of education? What does it mean in work opportunities later? What is that going to mean in the long term for women's labor market participation, which is already one of the lowest in the world in India? And we know that labor market participation is a really important factor in creating more equal gender relations in a society, right? So we don't know yet whether these things will happen, but there is enough reason to actually be worried about all of this. What has this meant in the context of COVID-19? Again, earlier speakers already mentioned the impact of these apps at a moment when we're all moving to digital spaces where more and more activities actually take place online, of course, have an impact. And I think one place where there has been a lot of concern about this is, of course, education. It has been a struggle to get girls to enroll and keep them into an education in the first place. And we have seen that in the country in the past decade or so, there has been substantial progress in that regard. But what does it mean now then, right? If so much of that education is going to move online, if so many families do not actually have the equipment to give each child their own phone, it shows that 8% of all households in the country with children between 5 and 24 actually have a computer and an internet connection. And for many of us, we know that a lot of the more substantial tasks are much easier to do on a computer or a laptop in the first place than they are on a mobile phone, right? So we're not even talking about that part. Let's even just look at the mobile phones and the fact that when a family has to share a phone, especially teenage girls are often the lowest on the hierarchy in terms of who will get access to that phone. This causes tension. Again, this is not going to stop with the pandemic. Of course, the new educational policy speaks about blending online courses with traditional teaching going forward as well. And so this really raises questions then about, are our girls going to have access to the same quality education as boys do? I want to talk a little bit more, though, about a slightly different set of impacts that we found. My colleague Radhika Radhakrishnan at the Internet Democracy Project has been researching the impact of surveillance and data surveillance during COVID-19, specifically on marginalized communities in India. And she found in her research a number of things related also to digital access and control over access. And I wanted to show you some images also. There are 4 things I wanted to highlight here. And all of these images are using quotes that that people we spoke with in the research shared with us. It's part of a bigger campaign. So each one that you will see, there's actually 4 images in this particular series, but I'm just showing you one. If you want to see the full series, you can check our Instagram or Twitter accounts. But the first one is an impact on livelihoods. And I want to give here the example of sex workers, where the fact that everything has shifted online has caused multiple challenges. There is the challenge of access, definitely for some sex workers, even though others do have access to mobile phones, are knowledgeable, have the skills to use things like ATM as well. For many, the mobile phone use that they have is actually much more basic. Maybe perhaps even more important than that is the fact that there simply aren't spaces of privacy necessarily to use a mobile phone to engage with clients the way you want to. And many sex workers have not necessarily shared with their families what kind of work they are doing. They might be having 2 SIMs, this was shared with us by Vishaka from Point of View, that often they have 2 SIMs, one for professional use, one for private use, and they take the professional one out of their phone in the evenings. Now that SIM is just left aside, so because they are worried that otherwise their families will find out, and there is no space to engage with clients anymore at all, not to send them small video clips, for example, either, just to keep a connection going, and that has an impact on livelihood. The second one I wanted to share was related to issues of domestic violence. Again, there are 2 angles here. The first one, which I think has been talked about in the media, thankfully to some extent also, is the challenge of reporting, right? If you are a victim of domestic violence, which indications have shown has increased during the pandemic, how do you actually report that if you do not have access to a phone, or if you do not have the private space to actually use that phone? But what we also noticed was that phone use itself can also lead to domestic violence. And so, for example, there was an incident in our research of a queer person whose queer identity was outed to their family, who they had to live with during the pandemic, because their family got access to their phones, saw who they had been speaking to and what they had been saying. And that in turn also then led to tensions at home and eventually violence. So phones become, the link between phone and privacy is as important in many ways to investigate, to see what women can actually do even if they have access to a phone, as well as sexual minorities for that matter. A third issue I wanted to highlight was relating to online banking. It's a slightly different matter, but the government has put into place a number of relief programs. One needs to have an Aadhaar number that is linked to a bank account to receive that particular relief. If there's 2 challenges here. One is if you are actually now using another phone than you were earlier and are not receiving the OTPs when any transactions are being made in your account, you have no way of knowing what comes in, what goes out, and who takes it out. That is because, as this quote showing, banks in many rural areas have closed, do not give out statements, and the e-mitra kiosks, the bank representatives that come to villages, actually do not inform people about their bank status and how much money there is in their account. So even though the Digital India program has been in place for many years now, we still see that for women, actually having control over those funds becomes complicated if they do not also have control over a phone. Because if that phone is not with you, if you do not have knowledge of what goes in or out of that account, your family members can actually use money without you even having the faintest idea. And then the last example I wanted to use is again in a way about a livelihood issue, but also related to the government's lack of sensitivity to these issues, which I think is a real problem, seeing this push for Digital India, right? Ashas in Punjab were actually asked to download an app, which they had to use while they were surveying houses in neighborhoods for people who were COVID-19 positive. But they had to provide the phone themselves, they have to pay for data packets themselves, they have to make sure that they have the right skill set themselves. So basically they are asked to do the government's work while using a resource that we effectively know many women have access to. And this led to a lot of protests. And when the Aishas eventually went on strike, it was part of their demands that this really needed to be addressed. These were some examples of the more unexpected outcomes that we found in our research. I am sure that the other speakers in the session will have many more things to share, but I want to start with these. One last thing I wanted to add specifically about the pandemic is this. When it comes to the gender gap in the pandemic, a friend, when we were discussing this session just now on Twitter, actually said that they had also noticed that many women, that there were very few women participants when social movements did campaigns online. And I think it raises a lot of question also for resistance and protests, right? If we are not able to do that offline anymore, whose voices will actually get heard? What can help? This is the final question that I would still like to address. I'm sure the response needs to look at many different areas at the same time. I'm also quite sure that we can't simply battle this at the level of values, right? If a family feels there is a threat to their family traditions, the responsibility and honor of their family, of the women in their family, when they access mobile phone, if they feel that matters, we are not going to win this battle by telling them it doesn't. And so I think what we need to get at is really trying to approach this as at a tangent. And there is 5 categories I think we need to look at. The first 2 have already quite wide recognition. Cost does matter. It was interesting to see how the launch of Geo a few years ago seemed to really have increased the internet penetration in India. And for families where cost is a real concern, this can help. The second category are questions about content and formats. For example, it seems that video consumption is really important for women. Can we focus more on that? There have been experiments also with voice, though those have not all been successful. But can we explore in more detail the potential of these kind of technologies to see if it helps to make more women feel welcome on the internet and make it a space where they can really contribute. A third category is perhaps we need to start looking more at what kind of incentives can be provided to encourage families to support girls and women on the internet. It's interesting that in our research, we often found that women talked about how open so I'm talking about Western UP and Haryana here, how open your family is to you using the internet is related to the distance to the road. The distance to the road is the distance to the road to Delhi. And this is in a way, it means how clued in are you, or how clued in do you want to be to what a big city stands for. This is about questions of upward social mobility, right? Which many families do have, that desire for upward social mobility. And so perhaps there is space to think more about how can we play into that to encourage mobile phone use. And education is likely one space where one might be able to experiment more with that. Perhaps we should also look more at highlighting the role models of women in tech and what they actually have achieved in this country, because there are actually still, by world standards, in India, the number of women in tech is relatively high. The fourth area is around language and values. I think we need to be really careful about how we talk about tech and what we encourage young women to do with it. For example, when we talk about online violence, what you see is a lot of do this, don't do this, directed at girls, without really taking into account their larger context. For example, women are consistently told not to put their pictures on the internet, but then it's always funny, I'm speaking on an event like this, my picture is on the internet because I'm in the event, right? And I'm saying that because I think this is part of being a professional today, right? You cannot stop these things. So to tell girls consistently that the burden is on them is really not useful. I think we need to talk about things like harassment in a way that really empower women and don't restrict them, so that it doesn't become the same situation as what we see on public streets, where women effectively often feel they need to hide, be careful, be watchful all the time. It shouldn't be on us. And finally, the last area where I think that we need to look at is really about policy models and infrastructure. At the moment, we often don't even have the language to talk about the harms that we see. So if families are saying that mobile phones are not good places for girls to be, that obviously gets supported when there is a lot of harassment. But when we are talking about harassment right now, we don't even have the language to really talk about the harms that we see. So because we talk about data as a resource, non-consensual sexual images, for example, are actually treated as if this is just data. And so when they are shared, that's a data protection violation. But research has shown that this is not how women talk about non-consensual sexual images. They see this more, the way they experience the harm is much closer to sexual assault. So at the Internet Democracy Project, what we are doing is putting bodies back into the data debate. And then asking what policy do we need from there. So language and how we look at data is one issue, but then the final one on the policy models and infrastructure is to also really look at the political economy of all this. What are the business models and how do they harm us? How is infrastructure designed and how does that actually make the internet a less safe space for us? How do policy models enable all of this? When we've looked at violence offline, we know that, for example, mixed uses of street lighting, public toilets, all help to make streets safer spaces for women. We need to look at that level of the problem when it comes to the internet as well. I'll speak a little bit more about this in the afternoon, but I do think as feminists, we need to engage at all of these levels. I'll leave it here now. Thank you.